Hey everybody, Mike and Tim here, and most days, almost all the episodes we do, we look forward to recording. This one we do not. I don't want to talk about this. I don't want to deal with the emotions that I'm feeling, nor does Tim. Earlier this week, the week we're recording, there was a mass shooting in Nashville, about 10 to 15 minutes away from where my wife works. My daughter goes to high school, and it was at a small private Christian school. My wife and daughter attend and work at a small Christian private school. And I got to tell you, this, and I don't know, I mean, I've grown so numb to school shootings and mass shootings. And I don't know if it was the proximity. I mean, that's my only guess. But this one has tore me up completely and entirely. I have been an absolute mess the entire week. Because the day after the shooting, my son Seth comes home. Seth is 14. He attends a middle school. And uttered a phrase he had just learned, which was lockdown drill. He said it in his own Seth indomitable way, and thought it was fun. They got to hide, and it just broke my heart. And so I feel guilty for not feeling this bad for every shooting that happens. But I just have to say, man, I've really wrestled with this, and we even wrestled with what to do or even talk about it. But I don't know. I feel like I have to have some place. And there are so many connections between that church and that school and our church. One of my good friends here in Tennessee is dear friends with the husband of the head of school, the woman that was killed, rushing to the aid of the children. And so we're meeting tomorrow to talk about, the funeral and what that's going to be like. I mean, it's just lots of connections. And so I don't know, man. I know you felt this way. I think last year you were telling me. What was it that really had gotten you? I don't remember our conversation exactly.
I don't know. We talked about in therapy for a while this week why this hit harder and what tools to use to navigate that, or how to not, I can't remember how she worded it exactly, because I had that and somebody close to me who experienced assault at a Christian event and then miscarried. And they just felt very tied together. Not that they, well, I don't know. It's heavy week, heavy stuff.
Yeah.
I don't know how to respond anymore. But I also don't like that response, because I don't like the, not lethargy, but just kind of the
apathy.
Apathy is a good word for it.
That's
I don't want to feel apathetic towards this when it happens.
Yeah. Yep. So, I don't want to add to noise in the culture. I don't want to be virtue signaling about how sad I am. I don't want to be performative in any way, shape, or form, but there's absolutely no way I can talk about anything else right now. And so, the only way I know to do this is to process it. And I am an Enneagram 5, which evidently means that I live in my head. And it's funny because I've been forced out of my head into my body. Like even now, there's emotion right behind my eyes. I just want to start weeping.
Yeah.
And that's not a normal state of affairs for me. So I want to be super gracious. I want to be super honoring. I want to be considerate and have, room for people who feel very strongly about this in different directions. But I want to break this today into just some chunks. The first chunk is I want to talk about what happened and the environment of Tennessee and its state legislature. I want to talk a little bit about the evangelical connection with guns. I want to talk about some bad arguments I keep hearing about why nothing should be done. And then I want to talk about some biblical arguments that I hear employed in these discussions that are woefully and grossly distorting the biblical teaching on this. So anyway, and Tim has volunteered to go along for the ride, and per usual, insert his insightful questions and comments. So I just want to read their names. It feels important to me to do that. I also have to figure out like what we're going to teach on Sunday, how we're going to respond as a church. And there's this phrase in Mark 3 where Jesus gets angry and he's deeply distressed. And that Greek word that we translate deeply distressed means grieved. So anger mixed with grief like is the best way I've sort of tried to articulate what this is feeling like. And for some of you, you've been way closer to things like these, or you've suffered them yourselves. And I'm tempted to feel bad that I don't feel more bad, but this is just where I'm at. I don't feel more bad for more things, There's so much awful that I feel guilty for not feeling this badly all the time. And it's almost selfish when it's this close, but I don't know what else to do than to just sort of work through it. So the adults were all in their early 60s. Cynthia Peak was a substitute that day. Mike Hill, the janitor, and Katherine Koonce was the head of school. The kids were 9, all of them. William Kinney, Hallie Scruggs, and Evelyn Dieckhaus, and they were 9, and then obviously the shooter. The things that have stood out during this past week that I just made a note of, at a national level, there are several prominent Republicans still wearing AR-15 pins on their ties or their suits, which is obscene. The Tennessee does not have a red flag law. All those guns were purchased legally, even though she was under the care of a doctor. In fact, our governor's waiting to sign a law that says if you're over 21, you can carry a gun without a permit. You can just carry a gun. And we had both on the national and local level, people have been saying things like any talk of gun ban following the latest school shooting is just politics and emotion. And it is politics. The representative, and this guy, boy, it's tough not to want to really say nasty things, but the Tennessean representative of this district where this church and school was located in had a Christmas photo of he and his 3 children. 2 of his children and his wife and himself were holding AR-15s in front of a Christmas tree as a Christmas card. And when confronted about this, he simply said, "Why would I ever apologize for a family photo exercising my Second Amendment right?" Even though he pulled the picture down. He also had an Instagram post with a toddler in a front holder. I don't know if it was him, but it was a toddler hanging onto, it looked like an assault, either rifle or AR-15, and it just said, with the caption, "Weapons Training." There is a clip of him floating around where he says, oh no, this is Tim Burchett. This is another Republican from Tennessee. where Tim is interviewed on the steps of the State House, and he says, there's nothing we can do to fix this because criminals will be criminals. And that's held side by side with a clip of him saying that they will not stand for drag shows, and they will do everything in their power to ban them. The NRA last week tweeted out, if you want to ban AR-15s, you're an enemy of the Second Amendment. That's it. That's the tweet. And then very predictably, the scapegoating games begin immediately after we find out that the shooter was biologically female. I know that's controversial, but identified as transgendered and was misgendered by the police. And I mean, it's nuts. So NBC News has a headline, "Fear Pervades Tennessee's Trans Community Amid Focus on Nashville Shooter's Gender Identity." And obviously Christians get a hold of that and say, well, where's the outrage for the Christian community? William Wolf, just a really unpleasant fellow on Twitter, said the world has completely changed. There is no going back to a neutral public square where Christians and secularists live and let live. Transgenderism, the wokeness it represents, will destroy us entirely. Tucker Carlson, God bless him, the trans movement is the mirror image of Christianity and therefore its natural enemy. Christian and trans ideologies are totally incompatible. The Daily Mail U.S., not a reputable news source, but Nashville mass shooter was rejected by her Christian parents. Obviously, Christians get a hold of that and say, well, that doesn't excuse the murder of 6 people. The New York Post, the shooter's parents couldn't accept their daughter's trans identity. Our governor came out and said it's not yet time to talk about legislation. The Burchett fellow I mentioned earlier, saying, hey, we're not going to fix this, was also asked in the same clip, so how do you protect your daughter? How do we protect daughters like yours? And to which he responded, well, we homeschool her. So,
yeah.
So the movement, let me just get through this one last bit, Tim. The movement has been from gun owners and gun culture is to blame for this, to the trans people are coming for us and they're dangerous, to the evangelicals had this coming because their oppressive beliefs about gender and sexuality. And it's all so freaking predictable. Did you want to throw in something right there?
No.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about, I have a old acquaintance of mine named Michael Austin, who he and I went to grad school in philosophy and ethics together. Wrote a book called God and Guns in America. And in the foreword references a product that I looked up on Amazon, and it was real. It is a Bible cover that says Holy Bible. And inside there are no pages, but rather it's a holster for a handgun and a clip for ammunition. And it has one of those little carrying handles on the side. And it's just big gold letters, Holy Bible. You open it up, and that's where you stash your gun. Well, it is a profound image. And that's how it begins the book. And I highly recommend the book. But the person, I don't remember who it was, who wrote the foreword, was just saying, and that is the picture. And I went on Amazon, and there it is for $45. And you can even find guns with Bible verses emblazed on them. And so just to highlight some of the things that I've found disturbing this last week, white, and I've seen this from Pew Research, white evangelicals are more likely than all other people to own firearms. 41% of them do versus 30% of all Americans. And I don't want to get into a debate, because I'm not an expert on gun policies, about how best to fix this. I just really resent the people who refuse to do anything. That's where I'm very angry. And I also resent the really cavalier attitude that we have towards weapon and violence in the Christian community, and that violence is just naturally thought to be the Christian response in self-defense. There are also Christians and theologians that are arguing that carrying a gun is our Christian duty. But as others argue, don't mess with me because I can kill you is a deeply unchristian attitude. I was also thinking that if I got up and did a sermon where I was questioning one of the core doctrines of the Christian faith versus getting up and giving a sermon questioning the Second Amendment, under which circumstances would people be more upset? And I didn't have a clear answer. And I think that's deeply disturbing. One of the things the book argues, and I want to very much be sensitive to, is that for many people, guns occupy a place at the very heart of what it means to be an American. And the gun sort of symbolizes a way of life that is characterized by faith and freedom and family and self-sufficiency and patriotism and rugged independence and hard work. And in some subcultures, gun ownership is actually a sign of coming into adulthood. That guns are tied into masculinity and manhood. And in Austin's book, he quotes somebody who argues that there is kind of an American hero archetype that exists called the citizen protector. Did you see that part? And
and then they were referencing things like Jesus and John Wayne too, where she went.
Yes.
Deep dived into that idea.
Yes, Kristen Dumais, who is Christian. But a citizen protector, I've bought into this. It's an individual who believes that using deadly force against others is a morally upstanding response to a violent threat. And it's better to rely on yourself for use of deadly force than it is to trust police or military.
Right.
This kind of individual sees themselves as not a victim or a criminal. They're one of the good guys. And so gun ownership kind of symbolizes for the people who use them rightly, hey, I'm one of the good guys, and I stand, ready to help to, in situations where that sort of present threat is here. And we have folks who are really good people who own guns, use guns, carry guns, use them responsibly, love Jesus tremendously. I'm not arguing against that. When I'm arguing two things. Number one, the status quo is reprehensible and needs to be changed. And number two, that the Christian rhetoric employed to justify gun culture is not accurate, true, and it's harmful. If we want to own guns, we should do so in the rarest of circumstances and with the heaviest of hearts, rather than as a celebration of a certain way of seeing the world. We'll get more into that in the future. So I want to go. I'm not a Second Amendment expert. Loads of people, have conversations about, we infringe on the Second Amendment all the time. No one's allowed to own rocket launchers or, machine guns. So the right to bear arms is an absolute. It's also well regulated. That's not my lane. So I'm going to trust those experts to have those experts. But I do have thoughts, Tim, and we have thoughts about some of the arguments that are just thrown out when these sorts of debates are had. Number one, I hear this. I mean, these are all things I've just written down this week. That none of this is like pulled from years ago. This was just this week in response to this thing. Hey guys, no law can stop gun violence. And this is related to, hey, this isn't a gun problem, it's a heart problem. But I'm going to treat that as a separate issue. No law can stop gun violence. Correct. No law can stop abortion. And yet, there are many of these same people who are resisting laws restricting firearms who see the efficacy of laws when it applies to restricting abortion. So I find that interesting and inconsistent. Not only that, but no laws are foolproof. No one's arguing that there's a law out there that would eliminate every shooting ever.
Right.
Laws are intended simply to make it harder for criminals to do criminal activity. That's it. That's the goal. And when we're seeing my son with Down syndrome having to learn the phrase lockdown drill, something perhaps has run amok in our tolerance for this way of looking at the world. If a requirement for a law is 100% effectiveness, then why are there laws against rape, theft, or assault, since those laws don't prevent all occurrences? Right? Yeah. Law is not a matter of all or nothing. It's a matter of how easy or difficult it is to commit a crime. So I just don't buy that one. Secondly, and this is the one I've heard all week, we have a heart problem, not a gun problem.
Yep.
And the two examples are like, hey, Cain killed Abel with a rock, and God didn't ban rocks. Or Peter, right, grabs a sword, and Jesus didn't rebuke him for having a sword, but using the sword improperly. So guns are just like tools, and they can either be used correctly or incorrectly. But the issue is the evilness of the human heart. So just some thoughts, Timothy. Again, this rationale suffers from something called a false dichotomy. The assumption is that since we have a heart problem, it's not true that we have a gun problem. And I just want to say,
Correct.
Well, it's actually probable that it's both. And I would argue that because we have a heart problem, that actually argues for more restrictive freaking gun laws because we have a heart problem. If we didn't have a heart problem, then great, let's let everyone carry guns. I don't know how the idea that we have a sin problem somehow gets employed to argue that guns should be more readily accessible. To me, it makes the absolute opposite point, right? Not only that, the difference, and I hate that we have to explain this, the difference between rocks is that rocks aren't designed to kill large numbers of human beings quickly and easily.
Right.
Whereas certain kinds of guns are. Because the human heart is evil, and again, I've yet to meet anyone who can explain this to me. Why do we working to ban books? Why are we working to ban drag shows, transgendered care for minors? If laws don't work because we have a heart problem, then why all of this energy spent banning things? But yet when it comes here, no, we're not going to ban anything because we have a heart problem. It is mind-numbing how little sense that makes. Number 3, and there's more to say. Number 3, only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. And Lindsey Graham, bless him, looked at the video, and I watched the video of the cops entering in, and I was unbelievably compelled by that video. No hesitation, no fear, rushing. I applaud the heroism of those good guys with guns. And so Lindsey Graham tweeted out, that was a success. But only after 6 other people had been killed.
Right.
I'm not sure how much of a success that is, or how much of a deterrent it would have been. In fact, there's research that suggests that when people carry guns and are not trained in their use, it makes them more aggressive. George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin is a case study of this. That people who've anointed themselves citizen protectors are people who sometimes can operate in ways that are more aggressive and more escalating. So carrying a gun and having good guys with guns isn't as morally neutral as we think it is. Not only that, but even people who are well trained in firearms make mistakes. There have been over 1,200 innocent people who have died in good guy with gun scenarios since 2007. So, and it involves a real optimistic view of how I'm going to handle gunfire.
Right.
So, is it true that having armed guards could help? No doubt. No doubt. When I walk into the TSA airport, the airport checkpoints, and realize, hey, they've got stuff they can do if I'm out of line. Of course that helps. And so I'm not doubting the fact that there are times and instances where violence will actually serve as a way of loving and protecting our neighbor. Absolutely agree with that. But the claim that the only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun just isn't true. And it inhibits our moral imagination as Christians, because there are other ways to disarm people. Number 4.
Yeah, no, that's a great line that you just said. What did you just say?
Imagination.
Our moral imagination. Yeah. Because while you were talking about that, we talked in our classrooms about it this week a lot and had lively debates on this topic. And, was it Uvalde where the guy just stood outside with the gun?
Yep.
And not just the cops, but the security guard or whatever too. And,
yep.
Our moral imagination there just presupposes glorious outcomes to heinous scenarios rather than trying to prevent the heinous scenario. It's just so backwards.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, and the myth of the good guy with the gun, I mean, it's true, but it only happens after the fact, right? It doesn't happen before. Now, that's not always the case.
It's a huge gamble.
Well, it's again, the issue isn't, hey, it's wrong for these guys to go in shooting. No. The issue is that our moral imagination only conceives of responding to violence with violence. And Jesus introduces a whole other way of responding to violence. And I'm going to talk about that just in a second. I'm just chucking through things I've heard that I disagree with. And I know there are sweet, dear listeners who disagree with my takes on these things. Great. I'm all for having great policy discussions. What I'm against is the argument that we should do nothing. And I'm against the way Christians employ the Bible in this debate. So those are the two things I'm arguing against.
Or hide guns inside of them.
Oh, Lord. I mean, I have my dad's revolver. He was a police officer. That's very special to me. My mom bought me a shotgun when I was younger, when I moved to California. That's never been fired. It just sort of sits in a closet. So I'm not saying owning guns is bad. And the answer isn't to ban all guns. But why does there have to be so much resistance to the idea that we should do something? This is where I think it's become an idol in some circles. And I have my own idols. Guns just it's not one of them. Number 4, guns protect our other freedoms. So the Second Amendment protects all the other amendments. And I hear that. I understand that. But is always walking around ready to meet potential threats, is that really what true freedom and security looks like? Freedom is not continual vigilance in preparation for violence. Guns undermine the freedom from fear in everyday life. If I see a dude in a shopping, in a store, in a Walmart or in a grocery store that has an AR-15 around him, I'm not feeling more secure in that moment. I'm feeling way more fearful. Right? And individually, if I'm the kind of person who can't feel safe unless I'm carrying a gun, what does that say about my view of the world? It is not, and this is something Mike Austin argues, it is not often a sign of freedom and security. It's often a sign of fear and insecurity. Why do some of the people who said masks are caving in to fear, saying that they need to carry a gun in order to feel safe? Don't understand that. In fact, William Wolfe, the guy who, please do not follow, he said, when the riots in 2020 came to your city, the federal government turned their back on you. Most state governments did too. Now, this is a guy who's written a paper called "Why the Second Amendment is Biblical." Now, when a trans terrorist come to shoot up a Christian school, the federal government is turning their back on you again. No one is coming to save you. Now, my question is this: does that in any way sound like the worldview of Jesus of Nazareth? No one is coming to save you. It's up to yourself. I just want to say that worldview does not represent at all an integration with the worldview.
Yeah, what was it? What was Luke Skywalker's line in the worst Star Wars movie ever? Amazing, everything you said in that sentence was wrong. It's like a completely inverted sentence.
Yeah. And the idea is, Jesus marches around saying, listen, don't be afraid of those who could take your body. He's talking to people who are going to be put to death for their faith and saying, you don't go down swinging. Now, we're going to get to self-defense here in a little bit. So just hang on to that.
Take as many as you can with you, said Jesus never.
Austin also makes the point, guns don't protect freedom of speech, they silence it. So if all of a sudden I'm at a freedom of speech rally and somebody, like we have a protest in Franklin, Tennessee tomorrow, somebody shows up carrying an AR-15, and they're aggressive, does that really give me freedom to express how I'm feeling, or does that
Second Amendment
silence
trumps the First Amendment?
Oh my goodness. I've also heard this week, more guns make us safer.
Yes.
And
which is what are we at now? We have 330.
I've heard 400 million is
Americans. What I heard. Well, the population is 337 or 32 million people in the U.S. and there's 400 million guns.
Yeah,
somewhere in that region.
Yeah, Shane Claiborne. I always mispronounce his name. The U.S. has about 5% of the world's population, but half of the world's civilian-owned guns.
Half. That's insane.
And at least in Tennessee, which is all I'm kind of worried about, we keep weakening our gun laws, passing permitless carry in 2021. Meanwhile, the rate of gun homicide in Tennessee has increased 110% over the last decade.
110%.
Yeah. So I'm just John Stewart in this very viral clip where he's talking to a congressional representative. Just says, okay, how many guns does it take then to make us safer? And if the issue is a sin issue and a heart issue, at what point does that many guns override the weakness of our hearts? Right? I just don't. I don't see that. Now, the one I've really heard that is new to me is, hey guys, this is just a mental health issue. This is what one of the Tennessee representatives said. Why don't you change gun laws? Well, because this is a mental health issue.
Yeah.
And again, it's a false dichotomy, assuming that if it is, and it is a mental health issue, that means it's not a gun issue, and that's just not true.
Right.
If it is a mental health issue, then all the more reason to have red flag laws and make it harder. And again, I don't know the best policies to do this. I'm just saying these are the non-biblical, non-theological responses that are given by people, and I just don't see it. I don't see it even remotely.
What state is it? Was it Colorado? Somebody will email in and tell me how I'm wrong, but one of the states, I thought it was Colorado, maybe in Denver area, they were kind of pioneering sending mental health experts to
on police calls,
certain 911 calls instead of cops that aren't equipped for those things, and then they've seen a decrease in violence. It's like a trial run to see if this is an appropriate response.
I've talked about this before. I was a chaplain on a very active police unit, and I saw all kinds of craziness. And there are some officers that are really great at de-escalating, and there are some officers who were not. And but they don't receive mandatory training. So here's a 24-year-old single guy. He and I went to a domestic violence disturbance. And the kids are out front sobbing. Mom and dad are threatening each other, yelling at each other. One of them is bleeding. And how is a 24-year-old equipped to process, such a scenario? Not that I am, as a, at that point I was a 40-something-year-old guy, but
there are folks who are.
Yes. If it is a mental health issue, then, I agree. But again, if that part is true, that seems to argue for the opposite conclusion, that we should care much more about who can attain these weapons. Now, and I don't care. I know people are going to disagree. I don't know. I'm just processing this. I don't want to slightly be gracious, but I also don't care super much about being gracious right now because I don't think this is
You're doing a good job, though. I'm holding my tongue.
I don't think this is acceptable. We haven't cussed yet. All right, this is a quote from an article I read. Let's get into biblical and theological arguments. Okay, so how the Bible is employed. This is where I get even, where we get more fired up. No matter the original intent for the Second Amendment, as a concept, it is given too much weight and occupies too central a place in the moral imagination for many Christians in America today.
Yeah.
The Second Amendment is not in any way a legitimate starting point for Christian ethics. Christ is. The Constitution doesn't get to determine or delimit the commands of Jesus confronting us in this moment, calling for a responsibility.
Are the sentences that you just read.
Right. I mean, why do we trust the Second Amendment more than the Sermon on the Mount? That's what I've been wondering. And I do too. In my fallenness, yes, I do too. From the very beginning, Jesus disarms the theological argument that firearms are a God-given right. Because this is the guy who said the only way to treat other people is through nonviolent love. That's it. And as a symbol of the way in which you are to live your life, here's a cross where Jesus would rather suffer than having all power and prerogative. He could have fought. He even tells Pilate this. He's like, listen, if my followers were of this world, they would fight. But as it is, the Son of Man must go the way that's been set before him. So the defining characteristic of the kingdoms of the world is fight. The defining characteristic of the movement of Jesus is not fight. Now, we'll get to self-defense. Just hold on. But the fact that that's where we rush to, and we start with self-defense rather than we start with the call to carry our cross and follow him, which is the abandonment of our rights. See, you cannot claim a Bill of Rights and follow a crucified Messiah at the same time. That's just true. I mean, if Jesus...
That's going to be a hot take.
Well, no. What it means to take up your cross is to identify with the absolute vulnerability of Jesus of Nazareth and not claiming any of the rights that were his through his divinity, but rather, becoming nothing. And then Jesus talks about the responding in personal insult with creative goodness rather than insult for insult, or competing with evildoers for who can do the more evil. I mean, I just don't understand, but I do understand how it is that we get from a crucified Messiah, the most unjust suffering, and then a whole litany of 200 years of martyrs who displayed courage, not John Wayne, Bruce Willis, Sylvester Stallone courage, but the courage to stand in the face of martyrdom and be martyred. How we get from there to Constantine and Augustine, who said, no, the use of force is justified, to now it's your Christian duty to carry a gun. And anyone who questions it is just a liberal, woke pansy. And I just don't understand The evolution. All right, so let's talk just briefly about some of the Bible verses that I've heard quoted this week in defense of the status quo. Well, doesn't Jesus say in Mark 10 that he didn't come to bring peace, but a sword? Yeah, right. And then read the next verse where he says he's come to divide daughter and mother and son and father and daughter-in-law and mother-in-law. The sword is symbolic to say that if a family is divided over discipleship to Jesus, then that you should follow Jesus rather than your family. And in that day and age, that would have been a massive, I can't even describe how significant that is. So it's appropriate that he would use a sword as a metaphor for that. Mm-hmm. But sword as metaphor is used all over the place. Like Mary is told from Simeon, your son will be the cause of the rising and falling of many in Israel. And a sword will pierce your own soul too. And you're like, that's not a literal sword there. So can we not just grab the Bible verse where it says Jesus says, I came to bring a sword? That's not at all in context. But then, and this is the big one. Where is, oh, come on. There it is. This is the one so Luke 22, Jesus is about to be arrested. And Jesus asked them, he's just predicted Peter's denial. And Jesus asked them, when I sent you out previously without a purse, bag, or sandals, he told them to take nothing. Did you lack anything? No, the disciples answered. We lacked nothing. There was a very profound point he was making there. He said to them, but now if you have a purse, take it. And also a bag. And if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. Ooh. And people just in the verse right there. Huh?
Yeah. This one's been going around a lot.
Yes.
This verse.
Yes. Yeah. And as always, we cut the verse off right before we get to the explanation.
Right.
It is written. And so this is verse 37. Again, there weren't verse numbers. So the sentence reads, sell your cloak and buy one, for what was written is now being fulfilled in your hearing. He was numbered with the transgressors. That's from Isaiah 53, I think. So literally the Greek makes that the buying of a sword is connected to the prophecy that Jesus just reads. And what's absolutely fascinating is verse 37 is in the present tense. I tell you that this must be fulfilled in me. So he's saying, what's happening right now is that I must be numbered among the transgressors. And it was illegal for Jews to own a sword or carry a sword. All right? This must be fulfilled. What is written about me is reaching its fulfillment. And then the disciples said, see, Lord, here are 2 swords. That's enough, he replies. Now, some people will take this to mean, yeah, that's plenty, guys. You're good. Like, pack your sandals and your purse, and as long as you guys have a couple of swords, it's great. We don't read about them using swords ever. And in fact, the only one that uses a sword in this story is Peter, who cuts off.
And what is Jesus' response to that?
Yes, and Jesus' response to that is put your sword away. So if Jesus were encouraging the use of swords here, he says, put your sword away. And then in Matthew, he adds this line, all who live by the sword will die by the sword. Now, notice here that Jesus says, go to them. So he's talking to them plural. Okay? He says they are to go to buy a sword, singular. And they reply that they have enough, plural, 2. Or that they have 2 swords, plural. And then his reply is, it, singular, is enough. So the idea wasn't that they would go get armed. The idea was that they would be fulfilling this prophecy and only needed one sword to do it. Does that make sense? So it's in the present tense. Yeah. Jesus is saying, this is not for anybody else. This is happening right now. And then secondly, Jesus says, go buy a singular sword.
Wait, the first one's a very important distinction.
What's that?
This was a time and place that he was referring to.
Well, yes, and he ties it to a prophecy
people.
that was being fulfilled right there. And then if
Right.
you're obtuse enough to still miss the meaning of this, when Peter uses the sword, Jesus tells him to put it away.
Yeah, what are you doing? And then
So-
heals the person that he wounded.
Yeah, why would he tell them to carry weapons but not ever use them? And so he never tells them they're to use the sword or to draw the sword. Literally, that he only says to them, buy a sword so that it will be found in their possession. And this is after he's predicted the denial of the disciples, the betrayal of Peter or Judas, the denial of Peter, right? He's orchestrating all of this in fulfillment of prophecy. And not only that, but this phrase that Matthew includes, Luke doesn't, but all who live by the sword will die by the sword. Think about the implication of that. It's how carrying swords becomes a part of you and how they form you. To perish by the sword is to let a kill or be killed worldview consume you. The sword comes to define your very existence. So literally, that's the William Wolfe tweet. They're coming for us and no one will save us. That is not at all the heart of Jesus of Nazareth. But people will say, what about Revelation 19 where Jesus shows up? Mark Driscoll loves this, misusing this one, where Jesus shows up. He's on a horse. He's got a sword and there's blood all over his robe. And then you actually read the text and discover that always the blood that covers Jesus, whether it as a lamb or as Jesus, the blood is always his. And the blood is on his robe before the battle. It's not the blood of his enemies, it's his blood. Not only that, he comes with a sword, but it's coming out of his mouth, which is a reference from Isaiah about how the word of God penetrates and judges people. And not only that, Jesus has an army with him, but that army doesn't do anything. If you read, there's no actual fighting. Jesus just speaks.
Yeah.
And wins the victory. So I don't know what to say. One other bad theological take I just want to deal with is somebody tweeted, there are already laws against killing people. We don't need more laws. We need more God. And which is fascinating considering this was a Christian school where God was welcomed in.
Yeah.
And not only that, but Miroslav Volf has this great line, there's something deeply hypocritical about praying for a problem that you are unwilling to resolve. I think you had sent that to us. And in the Bible, prayer is never an excuse for passivity, ever. Prayer is partnership and activity with God.
Yes.
And so, I don't have a problem with thoughts and prayers. I think prayers actually do things in the world. But if thoughts and prayers are an excuse for inactivity or apathy, then they're nothing. We don't need more God. Yeah. I was watching, I told Tim, this is so dumb. But I went and watched the John Denver, George Burns movie, Oh God. And there's a sequel. And in the sequel, John Denver looks at George Burns and says, why do you allow war? And George Burns looks back and says, well, why do you allow it? And I agree with that theology. Like, God's sovereignty is manifested through his image bearers. And his image bearers just want to blame God. Well, God could have stopped this, but didn't. Or Satan. Yep, the world's evil and we just can't do anything about it. Or each other, right? It's the trans community. It's the mental health community. It's those dumb Republicans or those idiot Democrats. Instead of God's people actually exercising their agency in the world in peace, loving, mercy-filled ways to agitate for the flourishing of human beings. And I have no doubt that Jesus would agitate that those who trust in the sword would lay it down. because his kingdom not only presently represents, but in a future sense depicts a way of living where the only thing that weapons are good for are farming implements, right? That's all they're good for. And we're to be the people who live that now.
Yeah. Like Shane's doing literally.
Now let's talk about self-defense, Timbo, because that's the reason why a lot of Christians own guns. And we have people who carry guns in our church who do so because they're part of our security team, because there have been church shootings. And so how do we reconcile self-defense? Because, a lot of theologians spell out a difference between kill and murder in the Ten Commandments. And there are examples of self-defense in the Bible and so on. And so I want to follow some thinking of others who are much smarter than I. And I want to differentiate between pacifism, which is violence is always wrong and prohibited. I want to justify between that and justified violence, or just war theory, but applied to individuals, versus peacemaking or peace building. So 3 views: pacifism, justified violence, and peacemaking or peace building. Pacifism, I think, has a lot of scriptural support, particularly around the idea of Peter talks about imitating Jesus when he was insulted. He never insulted back. Sermon on the Mount, you've heard it said, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. I tell you to respond with creative goodness instead of vengeance. So I think there's good scriptural support there. Justified violence, they point to Bible verses too, and to common sense in the sense that, hey, biblically we have a right to life and a right to security. And part of that right to life is self-defense. And Paul even opens the door to that in Romans 13 when he talks about the government exercising a sword to restrain evil. And so, yeah, there's part I think there that you could argue. I think, I think that the biblical view is that violence against image bearers is always wrong, but sometimes it's necessary, and that doesn't excuse it, but it's a form of loving our neighbor. And so I don't hold a pacifistic view, and I don't hold a justified violence view. I hold a peacemaking view, where there is the very strong presumption against all forms of violence, where every attempt to de-escalate is first attempted, and violence is only used as a last resort and with great heaviness of heart. So I think we should be walking around as people who see themselves as safe in God's world. Even if we die, we are safe in God's world. That's the whole thing. That my right to life doesn't trump the fact that I am a member of the kingdom and of a resurrected community. I think that there are times my right to life could be used in service of God as martyrdom, where I yield that right to life. I could see in other places where the right to life is used as protection for myself and others. And so I don't want to make a determination ahead of time. I can imagine scenarios where, if asked to deny, like Jesus or whatever, in some horrible, like third world scenario where people would choose to die rather than to, betray Christ. Okay. I'm not going to go down swinging in that scenario. The problem is, of course, Jesus never, ever, 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 not one place ever, gives us permission to solve our problems through violence. And to make the self-defense argument, you've got to go into the Old Testament, which Jesus has a lot to say in terms of, it's a different game now. Right? So you read articles on the theological right to guns, and it's almost all Old Testament except for the passages I just read. And I hopefully have shown that those are misunderstood. But when you get to the New Testament, you have Jesus saying eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. He's not just repudiating a legal system. He's repudiating a way of looking at the world that says, I don't have to be self-protective all the time. I don't have to always be armed and vigilant. I don't always have to, like, there are worse things that can happen than me being shot. And that just sounds like nonsense to Americans. That's why we don't listen to the Sermon on the Mount, because it doesn't work. It's not practical. It's not effective. So we'd rather trust the Second Amendment than the words of Jesus. But Jesus repudiates force and power all over the place. The disciples are, when the Samaritan village rejects him and they're like, do you want us called on fire? Jesus yells at him, when he's talking to Pilate and he looks at Pilate and he's just like, you utterly have no power other than what my Father gave you. And if we want to really talk power, 72,000 angels are at my disposal, just in case you were wondering. So Jesus repudiated coercion and power and invited us to display nonviolent love for our enemies. And the question I want Christians to ask, me too, do owning guns help us to follow that Jesus more faithfully? Do owning guns tempt us into idolatry, trusting ourselves or something else for our safety and security in the world? Do owning guns form us into kinds of people who only see victims and criminals instead of seeing everyone as image bearers? Do owning guns cause us to be more aggressive or more aggrieved in our relationships with other people? Jesus didn't give the Sermon on the Mount in the middle of peacetime. He gave the Sermon on the Mount to people who lived under an occupying force that was terrorizing them through torture and execution. So we are way too trigger happy with the myth of redemptive violence. Our superheroes, we fall into this. We see Jesus coming back in Revelation, finally, to get everybody back. And it's simply not the case that that's the picture of Jesus ever. Jesus never deviates from the image of God on the cross. That's it. That is the defining picture of the whole Bible.
Yeah, his entire existence, right? So this is just dumb words, but showing up and subverting the violent notion that was originally predicted, right? So out of the gate, not coming as a revolutionary in that sense that they're expecting. But the verse that always that I always get tripped up on, just trying to understand, is, so not only does Jesus not use violence, he surrenders to it, right? Like it's instead of being the one that pushes back and fights for defense of life, of his own life or whatever, like he accepts his death. But that moment in the garden beforehand, when he wrestles, where he seemingly wrestles with what's coming, and shows that there is this is what I was thinking of when you said prayer as being active. In that case, like him praying and being like, hey, if this cup could be removed, like this is pretty gnarly. But knowing that he was still actively leaning into what had to be done. And
hello.
Okay, anyway, the fact that there was a deliberation of discernment that was marred by the reality of the situation, right? Like what he was about to enter into. Watching him wrestle with the human aspect of that, I just find very compelling, and I've always found that section very interesting. I don't understand it, but I'm always compelled when I get to that, because it's so human in the midst of a very deistic movement, if that makes sense. I don't know, like hey man, your humanity is showing. Like it's a I don't know, but in the terms of this conversation about using violence and redemptive violence, when our model for that is literally God becoming human and laying his life down as a response to violence. And I don't know.
No, that's absolutely right. Absolutely right. Greater love has no one than this, that you would lay down your life for your friends. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Jesus, I give my life as a ransom for many. No one takes it, I give it. And so, yes, I think there is a strong presumption against violence, like more than a strong presumption. I mean, I just think there is an absolute presumption of nonviolence. But I also recognize that if I were in a situation where someone was being hurt or threatened, I would respond to help. And there have been instances
and
where...
you've given that example before, right? With the lacrosse game.
Yes.
When you...
Yeah, not that I'm some heroic dude, but there was a guy who'd committed a robbery across the street. He's bleeding. He's on something that makes him super strong, super aggressive, and impervious to pain. So his hand is bleeding. I'm watching my 7th or 8th grade daughter, and he comes stumbling onto the field. One of the medical trainers, because he's hurt, one of the medical trainers goes out to see him, and he tackles her and begins to assault her. And for some reason, I had gotten up and started moving towards the field when I saw the guy, and so I went over and tackled the guy. But what I wasn't doing was hitting him. Now, I may have had to subdue him, but luckily,
but that wasn't the
300-pound dude. I just I tackled him, laid on him, and then I put my forearm on his jaw to keep him from biting me. And I felt right to do that. It felt right to do that. It would have been wrong to just sit and watch that. So I want to leave room for circumstances where there is no de-escalating. It's already escalated.
Right.
And but I don't want that. That seems to be the de facto or default or factory setting for Christians in America. Yes. And I want to reset
can I ask you a
it.
Question?
Yeah.
Where are you with your notes? I don't want to derail.
No, derail away, man. They're done.
Man, I can hear my voice it's like a quarter of a second response.
That's so annoying. I'm so sorry, dude.
I'm going to turn my volume down so that I can ask this question. Then I'll turn it up for your response.
Oh, I think you should keep it down the whole time. But yes.
All right. So if one way of looking at sin is this idea of missing the mark, right, which we've talked about a few times, multiple times, and missing the mark of being fully human or the ideal human, or missing the mark of what it means to be God intended as a human.
Totally. An image bearer, yeah.
So I've been governing my life for the last couple years as looking at power over structures. Where do I see humans exerting power over other humans? And that manifests itself in so many different ways. And I look at myself, how am I, even down to how I parent, how am I exerting power over in this scenario? Right. Now, when I look at the gun issue, especially with everything that you've just laid out and illustrated, how is it not seen as a preemptive? How can I preemptively have power over in any situation that I'm involved in? Because I see the argument for guns, and it's so often be armed just in case, be armed so that you can put this person down, be armed for the government coming to take, like that's one of the Second Amendment arguments is that, and I had students make this argument to me yesterday about well, when the government comes and it's like, is that a actual fear that you have, that they're coming for you and that you have to stand up to? And I know there are people that really are afraid of that, but
yes.
When I look at that power over structure, I see Christians posturing themselves in a not preemptive, but like positioning to have power over before a conversation even begins.
Right.
Before violence happens.
Right.
And then we baptize it on the backside. And
right.
I don't know. So I don't know. Does that feel accurate?
Oh, well, for me, for sure. I can't speak for anybody else, but absolutely. Absolutely. And this goes to something I think Gambus has said that so struck me. Like, so let's take Jesus clearing the temple out. He shuts it down. So people will use that, obviously. Well, here's Jesus using violence. And I mean, again, it's just more horse crap. Jesus, the temple was massive. Jesus does this in one small section. The vast majority of people would not have even known he was doing this. Secondly, he didn't hurt a thing. There's no harm done. He wasn't doing violence on anything. He was driving animals out. He was shutting down the temple as a symbolic action. So what we do as Americans is we go, oh, well, if Jesus did that, then there are times when I turn over the temples. And Gombis says, well, that's an unnecessarily narcissistic reading, where I'm the Jesus figure in the story.
Yes.
What's that?
So many of our readings are narcissistic.
Yes, where I'm the Jesus figure.
Lens. Yes, or that he's speaking directly to me with whatever topic.
No. That I'm seeing myself in my life as the Jesus figure, and because Jesus did this, I'm allowed to do this too.
Totally.
And so I'm the Jesus figure. So when Jesus confronts the religious leaders, I'm thinking to myself, yeah, I should confront religious leaders too, because I'm the Jesus figure in the story. And Gombis beautifully, humbly, quirkily reminds us that we're the audience, that we're not the Jesus figure, the Peter figure, the Paul figure. Who we are, we have to immediately interrogate, am I people selling? Am I the person selling there? Am I the person attending there being victimized by the temple, or am I doing the victimization, or am I both? Right? The point of the story isn't to say, well, if Jesus did it, I can do it.
Right.
The point of the story is to say, where am I rescued from the people that devour the houses of widows and require them to give every last thing? Or where am I devouring widows' houses and requiring them to give every last thing in the name of God?
Yeah.
I'm not the Jesus figure. I mean, and that's why, as no matter how great Dallas Willard is, they're not inspired. That's why there's a unique authority to Paul and Peter that we don't have. And so to just import something they did 2,000 years ago in a very different set of cultural circumstances and think that somehow that then applies to me as the Mike figure, as I'm now Jesus to people and Peter and Paul to people, right? I mean, arrogance of that, right? And so this whole way of interpreting the Bible is at odds with the true disciples that we see in the Gospels, who at great cost, at great risk, and with incredible vulnerability present themselves before Jesus regardless of how big a sacrifice they're making.
So it's a failure of moral imagination. It's a failure of discipleship.
Yeah. So for instance, we're on a call. And again, I don't like.
Did your phone start ringing right when you said you're on a call?
That's funny. I don't like telling stories where I look heroic. A, because I want to be, and I want to resist that urge all the time. And B, it's not true, right? Like dying for someone else is totally glorious, and I'd do it for a second. Serving somebody else, that's a much harder proposition. So, right, I just want to admit all of my duplicity in sharing stories like this. But we're on a call, and there's a homeless guy. And homelessness was rampant in the city we were in. And usually they had homeless liaison officers, but this was at night, kind of middle of the night. And this guy was acting very strange and, potentially aggressive. And so we're with two other cars of officers. So like there are 4 officers and me. And, there's local hospitals are overrun, and so they can't accept patients unless they're doing harm to themselves. And so there's, at least in our scenario, there wasn't any readily available option. There was only escalator or de-escalate. And because I'm an idiot, I just went up and I put my arms around the guy, and told him that he was loved. That's all I did. And of course he just melts, starts sobbing, starts pouring out his life. And I learned two things in that scenario. Number one, I learned how easily my moral imagination exists on the following binary, right? Win or lose, victim, or hero, right? There's no there's just the binary of like harm or be harmed. I mean, that's just the automatic default response. Does that make sense? I'm not saying that well.
Yeah.
But the second thing was, and we've seen this with Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi and others, where there is a different kind of power. And I think that's what Jesus is encouraging us to, that yes, of course, there are times, perhaps, when all other options are exhausted, where violence is the right answer. And I don't mean force, because I was using force against the dude that hopped the fence. I didn't feel wrong. I wasn't trying to harm him. I was trying to restrain him.
Right.
But there have to be scenarios where if for the love of neighbor, I have to act to harm another. And so granted all of that, the default setting, though, is what Jesus challenges. The default setting for the human population is the myth of redemptive violence, or the myth of violence as a preventative. And to some degree, there's some truth to that. But that's not the Christian moral imagination. The Christian moral imagination is the dude's homeless and potentially violent, so go hug him. And that was not a normal reaction I would have to homeless people. I am not in any way virtuous in that regard. But in that moment, I was, I felt like it tapped into something that had a profound power beyond the simple continuum of harm or be harmed that I operate in. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And again, I hate even telling that story, and I think I'm going to ask you to cut it out, but
I'm not going to. The when you, at the beginning, when you talked about pacifism, I forgot what the second one was, and then the last one was peacemaking. Right at the beginning.
Yeah, peace building or peacemaking.
Well, I love 100, 200 episodes ago, we did something on peacemaking versus peacekeeping.
I love that you can remember that.
Well, because there's certain things like that have had a profound effect on me that I've held onto for a long time now, where it's like, okay, peacekeeping is inactive. It's not like you're just trying to not rock the boat or whatever, but this idea of peacemaking, this active
you run
force
to conflict,
going out into the world.
That's right.
Yeah, but to make peace.
Yeah, to de-escalate.
Not to, so like you talked about redemptive violence, or I guess preemptive violence. And then, but this idea of going with the intent of creating peace, making peace actively, is profound. And so when I think about what our response is to this entire conversation, it's how can I be a peacemaker in today's society?
Right.
And that's not just with like stopping violence, but it's also with how we get involved with trying to change the culture around all of this.
That's so good. Yes. Peace.
Another thing too is like with the with the other half of the go ahead.
No, I just have to jump because peace, as you're saying, isn't the absence of conflict. It's flourishing. No. And so does my carrying a gun help me to promote human flourishing? Or does it become...
And some people would say yes.
Yeah, and I believe that for some people. I do.
I don't. But the other side too with what you just said was actually what I was going to say next. And so the other side of that sin question that I asked and is, I have all the stats pulled up. I was going over them before we started with just the gun violence deaths from this year. So this 3 months. And we're at 10,327 gun-related deaths through March 9th. So,
oh wow,
3 months of 2023. 4,387 are homicide. and murder or unintentional gun use, and then almost 6,000 are suicide. There's been 131 mass shootings.
Oh.
So when I think about peacemaking, when I think about sin as missing the mark of what we are supposed to be as fully formed humans, when you flip that to the other side and you think about 10,000 people that have died in this country in 3 months, how, if my job if part of my job as a Christian is to edify and to lift up and respect and appreciate and dignify the humanity of other people, I have to react to those numbers and how to prevent those as a peacemaker.
That's right.
Right? Like, that's my duty as a human being in the kingdom of God.
I think so. I mean, I want to be super gracious with people who disagree, but I don't want to be super gracious with people who disagree that we shouldn't do anything. Like, if that's their argument, I think they're morally corrupt. That they can look at a figure like that or these students and say, well, that's just what we have to live with when no other country lives like this, and then baptize
by
that
a large margin.
I think that's a morally corrupt view of the world. Absolutely, that Jesus would challenge in a heartbeat. And I have my own morally corrupt views of the world, for sure. Absolutely. So I'm not sitting here standing in judgment of other people who have morally corrupt views of the world. I'm just simply saying that our moral imagination has shrunken to the place where the only thing that some of us look at is the Second Amendment. That captures us before Jesus' vision or Jesus' person or the Sermon on the Mount does. And that's a problem. Yeah. Like, there's a gun fetish in the world and in the church that just is not okay. Not even remotely. And if we're not willing to self-reflect on that, if this is one of those things where we just simply say, oh, no. If you question the Second Amendment, you're X, Y, and Z. Well, I disagree. So Tim had a great idea. We've done this before. I hate that we're doing it again in this circumstance. But Tim, why don't you explain what prayers of the people are?
So we've done this a few times on here, and I've been trying to incorporate it when I teach at churches too, because I think, Mike, you said this earlier, that I have been on a journey personally of discovering, as I try to understand prayer, seeing it as that partnership and that active way of acknowledging those things that need to be done, or in grieving or in lamenting. And there's quite a few prayers of the people, liturgical responses to things, taking in the prayers of the people in your community, both your immediate community and then your larger community around you as well. So we've done this a few times. I think this was written by a band called The Brilliance, which somebody emailed in, so they have connection to. So if so, tell them thank you. But it's a way to corporately sing and ask Jesus to intervene and to acknowledge through prayer what's going on. So I'm going to try to do it with this echo in my ear. I'm
so sorry. So Tim's going to sing a piece. I will say a piece. Tim will sing a piece, and so on.
Yeah. See how that works. Hear us calling, you hear us calling, Abba Father. You hear us calling, you hear us calling, Abba Father. Lord, have mercy. Christ, have mercy. Lord, have mercy. Christ, have mercy.
Father, we pray for the families of Evelyn Dieckhaus, Mike Hill, William Kinney, Katherine Koonce, Cynthia Peak, and Hallie Scruggs. Lord, we grieve so heavily again over this loss of precious and innocent life. We pray that their communities would come alongside them, love them, and sit with them. We pray that we do not grow calloused and accepting of this continuing and escalating violence.
Lord, have mercy. Christ, have mercy. Lord, have mercy. Christ, have mercy.
Father, we ask that you would soften the hearts and open the eyes of your people, that they would see this violence for what it is, that they would choose life and the edification of humanity over rights and tools of destruction.
Lord, have mercy. Christ, have mercy. Lord, have mercy. Christ, have mercy.
Father, we pray that you would give courage and integrity to those who have chosen to lead, to those we have chosen to lead. Give them discernment and clarity, wisdom and empathy. Father, allow them to see these tragedies for what they are and to act accordingly. Please grant us all the courage to see your kingdom here and now, to advocate for the upside-down nature of your vision and to love our neighbors, all of them. May they know us by our love.
Hear us calling, Abba, Father. You hear us calling, Abba, Father. Lord, have mercy. Christ, have mercy. Lord, have mercy. Christ, have mercy.
Amen. Till next time, friends.